But to all of you participating in this 1988 Student Congress on Evangelism, it's an honor to be with you. I know you come from all over America, some even from as far away as Alaska, and from a number of foreign countries as well. So let me say welcome to Washington, and I hope you don't mind the heat. But since I'm talking to a church-going audience, this heat reminds me of a story that took place back in my hometown of Dixon, Illinois. It was one smeldering summery Sunday evening, and the minister in our little church mounted the pulpit and announced that he was going to preach the shortest sermon he had ever given. And then he said, just a single sentence, if you think it's hot now, just wait. Well, I'm not going to preach a sermon. I thought instead I'd simply share a few thoughts with you on a subject I've had the opportunity to think about quite a bit during the years I've held this office. The subject of moral and religious values in our public life. And first, I'd like to spend a moment or two looking at the history of religion in our public life, and then I'd like to speak about the challenge before us today. Whenever I consider the history of this nation, I'm struck by how deeply imbued with faith the American people were, even from the very first. Many of the first settlers came for the express purpose of worshiping in freedom. Historian Samuel Morrison wrote of one such group, doubting nothing and fearing no man, they undertook all to set all crooked ways straight and create a new heaven and a new earth. If they were not permitted to do that in England, they would find some other place to establish their city of God. Well, that place was this broad and open land we call America. The debates over independence and the records of the Constitutional Convention make it clear that the Founding Fathers were sustained by their faith in God. In the Declaration of Independence itself, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "All men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." And it was George Washington who said, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports." Well, later, the statesmen gathered in Philadelphia to write what would become our Constitution. They often found themselves at odds, their purpose lost in acrimony and self-interest, until Benjamin Franklin stood one day and said, I have lived a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? And then he called that Constitutional Convention to open each day with prayer, which it did. For decades, America remained a deeply religious country, thanking God in peacetime and turning to Him in moments of crisis. During the Civil War, perhaps our nation's darkest hour, Abraham Lincoln said, I have been driven many times to my knees by the conviction that I had nowhere else to go. Well, believe me, no one can serve in this office without understanding and believing exactly what he said. During World War II, I remember a rally to promote war bonds that was held at Madison Square Garden in New York. The rally featured the great figures from government and great stars of the theater. And many times those people proclaimed, almost virtually every one of them who came out on the stage and addressed the vast audience, almost every one of them proclaimed that God was on our side. And then it remained for a $54 a month buck private to speak 9 words that no one there that day will ever forget. His name was Joe Louis. Yes, the Joe Louis who had come from the cotton fields to become the world heavyweight prize-fighting champion. And now, this $54 a month private walked out to center stage after all those other celebrities that had been there, and he said, "I know we'll win because we're on God's side." There was just a hushed moment of silence, and then that crowd came to their feet with just about the most heartfelt applause and ovation that anyone has ever heard. The master of ceremonies was the comedian George Jessup. And George said, "Joe, you have just laid a rose on Abraham Lincoln's grave." Well, during the civil rights struggle of the 50s and early 60s, millions worked for equality in the name of their creator. Civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King based all their efforts on the truth that black or white, each of us is a child of God, and they stirred our nation to the very depths of its soul. And so it's been, it has been through most of our history. All our material wealth and all our influence have been built on our faith in God and the bedrock values that follow from that faith. The great French philosopher visited our country, Alexis de Tocqueville, 150 years ago. He wanted to see if he could find the secret of our greatness already as a young country. And then he observed that America is great because America is good. And if she ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. And this brings me to the challenges of the present day. For we must admit that in recent years, America did seem to lose some of her religious and moral bearings. We saw the signs all around us. Years ago, pornography, while available, was mostly sold under the counter. By the mid-70s, it was available virtually on every magazine rack in every drugstore or shop in the land. Drug abuse used to be confined to limited numbers of adults. During the 60s and 70s, it spread through the nation like a fever, affecting children as well as adults, and involving drugs that were once unheard of, drugs like LSD and PCP. But perhaps most important, the American family used to be the unquestioned basic building block of our society. And then families too often found themselves under pressure from government, taxation, welfare policies that were spinning out of control, and social mores that were being undermined. Liberal attitudes viewed promiscuity as acceptable, even stylish. Between 1970 and 1980, the number of two-parent families dropped while the number of single-parent families almost doubled. Teenage pregnancies increased significantly. And although total births declined during the decade between 1970 and 1980, the number of illegitimate births rose about 250,000. These problems are still with us, but I believe there's been a change.